Welcome. In this webinar, I just wanted to introduce you to the International Summit of the Teaching Profession, an event that we hold every year together with our colleagues from Education International, and one of the countries that is very innovative in education. This year, it was in Helsinki. The idea is really to bring together
if you have questions
governments
about
and union leaders to think about the future of the teaching profession, the challenges ahead, but also the ways and solutions in which those challenges are addressed in different contexts. Overall, the picture looks quite bleak. On the chart that you see in front of you, we can see in our PISA assessments, progress has been very moderate. On average, the world looks pretty much the same in 2015 as it looked in 2006. But we know there are exceptions. You can see a country like Portugal, moving from way below the average now to actually becoming a good performer at the OECD, or we can see systems like Singapore moving from good to great. So there are interesting examples where we do see a lot of educational progress. Some associate this with money, but in fact, our data don't show that much of a relationship with spending once countries spend above a certain threshold of spending. You can see the blue dots. These are the OECD countries. The link between investment on the horizontal axis and science performance on the PISA test is rather tenuous. And the same picture emerges when you look at time. There are huge differences among countries in the time that students spend learning at age 15 in school, that's the blue bar, but also out of school, that's the yellow bar. You can see here, for example, the United Arab Emirates is the #1, where students spend close to 60 hours learning, whereas in Finland, on the left side, is little more than half than that. Huge differences in the volume of learning time. But when you look at productivity, learning gains per hour of instruction, you can see that in countries like Finland, students learn a lot in very little time. And in the United Arab Emirates, they spend a lot of time and learn rather little. So it's like almost, with money, the time investment, the volume of time is not a good, predictor for the quality of learning outcomes. And that sort of raises the question of, how can we improve the learning experiences, the quality of the learning experiences? That obviously has a lot to do with instructional environments and the quality of teaching. It's very hard to do that. Some people say education is like, changing and moving graveyards. It's so hard to rely on the people out there to help you because the status quo is just so many protectors. And sometimes we as parents are, part of the problem, not just necessarily part of the solution. We get very anxious when our children no longer learn things that were so very important for us, or we get, even angry when our children learn things that we did not learn, because we always project our own experiences. Teachers are sometimes more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And as a policymaker, you can lose an election over education, but you rarely win one over education because it just takes so much time to translate better ideas into better outcomes. There's also a big asymmetry of the costs and benefits of education reform. The costs are always certain, they arise immediate. The benefits, we don't know about them, they're long-term, and those make change and improvement in education really, really hard. And that's the reason why we bring together governments and union leaders to discuss those kinds of issues. One of the topics this year's summit focused on was on collaborative or shared leadership in education at every layer of the education system. That's something that I think every education system realizes is so critically important for advancing the education agenda. And that when you think about it, the topic of inclusion in the past, education was mainly about sorting. We only needed some people to be very successful and lots of people to work for those people. Now today, we need to ensure that all students find their way to success. And some of the countries in PISA show that's an attainable goal. Actually, social background has been rather disconnected from, or quite effectively disconnected from learning outcomes. That's one of the big challenges for 21st century leadership, really developing systems that are not just sorting people, but really developing human talent, moving from, just teaching routine cognitive skills that are disappearing from our economies and labor market to fostering complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working. Some people include social emotional skills in this. So the agenda has become far more demanding in terms of the kind of knowledge, skills, attitudes that make people successful. And that commands a very different caliber of teachers. In the past, it's still in some systems today, teaching is fairly prescriptive, fairly kind of standardized. In others, systems have moved much more to sort of a profession of high-level knowledge workers who have much greater ownership of professional practice, work also in a very collaborative culture. And you can see this in the work organization. And that has, it meant the shift from the kind of Tayloristic industrial work organization to a more flat, collegial, and entrepreneurial schools where, and again, the leadership dimension of a school autonomy becomes much more important, as do accountability systems. Now, in the past, knowledge and information flows would be mainly upwards. Today, they are mainly outwards, talking to the next teacher, the next school, the next system to become better. If you look ahead, we looked at some of the global trends. In the next 10 years, we're going to see half of the world population joining the global middle class. And actually, 9 out of 10 entrants in the next 10 years are going to come from China and India. So actually, there's going to be a big shift in gravity. That's sort of the nice way of looking at the other picture is actually that, while more people belong to the middle class, inequality is rising as well. Now, the top 10 earners, 10% earners now earn 10 times as much as the bottom 10% earners in the OECD area. So again, this is a challenge that ends up on the doorsteps of schools. The growing social inequality, economic inequality puts just much greater challenges up for individual schools that leaders need to address. Education mobility, the great promise that, our children are going to be better educated than we used to be, it still works, in some of the education systems. You can see here the example of Cyprus, of the Russian Federation, Singapore, Korea, and our host Finland. But at the same time, you look at the right side of the chart, countries like the Czech Republic, Germany, Turkey, Austria is only a kind of minority of people. So, we can no longer take this as a guarantee. We need to work harder to ensure that education remains a social elevator. International migration, everybody familiar with those kinds of numbers, huge rise in the international migrant stock. Sometimes in Europe, we think that's a European story, but in fact, the largest numbers are now also here in the Asian region. Volatility, we save less and take more debt, and that actually makes us individually, but also collectively, much more vulnerable to external shocks. And again, it's a trend that has been pretty consistent. Declining voter turnout, big phenomenon in some countries. Look at the data for Chile, for the Czech Republic, Slovak Republic here, and our sort of democratic participation used to articulate itself in people going to vote. And again, that's under question, under pressure, at least in some of the systems here. The rise in technology, now we have more broadband connections than people in the OECD area, not changing everything around us, not making us connected, giving us new tools, and so on, and also in fueling the growth in artificial intelligence. You can see here an almost kind of exponential growth in the number of patents in artificial intelligence technologies, and that puts the question of digitalization right front and center in education these days. Digitalization has been incredibly democratizing. Basically, everybody can collaborate, participate, engage, but it's also concentrated power at a rate that we have never seen before. Think about the Googles, the Facebooks, and so on. Digitalization has been incredibly particularizing. The smallest voice can be heard everywhere, but it's also been incredibly homogenizing, squashing individuality, cultural uniqueness. It's incredibly empowering. Basically the bigger companies these days are created with a big idea, not with a big industry. They often have the product before they have the money, sort of huge kind of empowerment tool. But at the same time, we also become increasingly the slaves of algorithms who tell us, what to do, what to think, and so on. So digitalization has, the different forces, and actually where you stand on the chart has a lot to do with your education and skills. We surveyed people on this at age 15 in PISA, and you could see here that in a fair number of systems, the vast majority of students think that or say that they are feeling really bad if they are not connected to the internet. So being connected has become like drinking water and breathing air. And you can also see the time that students spend online outside school on a typical school day is dramatically risen from 2012 to 2015 alone. The digital world is becoming the real world. And that, of course, raises questions about leadership. Some of the things that we discussed at the summit was that leaders really need to be very transparent with teachers about where reform is heading and what it actually means for them. Actually, our Chinese participant brought that out very clearly. How do you need to bring people on board in the design of change if you want to rely on them in implementation? You're making teachers really part of the instructional system, the design of solutions, rather than just handing things for implementation. Be acutely aware of how organizational policies and practices can facilitate or inhibit change and transformation. Tackle the kind of institutional structures that are always built around the interests of adults, not children, in our education system. Recognize, the kind of trends shaping the future of education and also how they might interact with educational goals. Understand what motivates people. Now, many countries, we discussed it, have tried to make teaching financially more attractive, paying teachers more. Now, teachers are still not well paid in most countries, some actually quite poorly, but that's something that people have recognized. But the much harder challenge these days is to make teaching intellectually more attractive. Now, see, these things are becoming really, really important for education leaders. What we also discussed, and what is very important, that often we talk about programs, initiatives, but actually programs rarely scale. They're always good examples, but what scales is ultimately culture. And it's our success to make programs systemic, to transform, practice into culture that scales. And culture is, in a way, always the hallmark of effective leadership. It's about system learning. It's about system-wide innovation, and also about intentional collaboration. That brings me to the second theme of the summit, from leadership towards early childhood education and care. How can we build strong foundations for lifelong and life-wide learning? There is increasing evidence that the early years provide a very, very important window for the cognitive, but also social and emotional development of children. Now you can see here brain sensitivity is particularly high in the age groups for some of the skills, 2 to 3 years. It varies across skill domain, but we need to get a better understanding of what children learn best at what age to design effective opportunities. Much of the early learning has been designed around child care needs, parental employment. All of those things have driven the expansion of early childhood education and care, but only now are we understanding the importance of those opportunities to actually foster learning. We're doing that at the OECD as well. We have actually developed an assessment of child well-being and early learning, looking at social, emotional, and to some extent also cognitive skills. Here is a chart from Estonia, where actually these data are still sort of under review, but you can actually see that there is a very strong interaction between the literacy skills, the kind of oral literacy skills of children, and social emotional dispositions. When you see, like, basically teacher reports here in Estonia, children who had a better grasp of the world, they were more likely to like to learn new things, to understand other feelings. That's the empathy dimension, or to be emotionally moved by problems of books in of people in books or stories. And those odds ratios are actually, if you look at this, very, very significant. So we're beginning to understand those interrelationships, making a stronger case for early childhood education and care. Our PISA study also shows very clearly that students who had attended early childhood education and care for less than 1 year were also much less likely to be highly proficient in science at the age of 15, or much more likely to be among the bottom performers. Now, we do not know to what extent these are, cohort effects and in truth, because these are not true longitudinal data, but they are the perceptions of 15-year-olds to what happened to them early in their childhood. But still, I think it's something that we should be thinking about. Enrollment has also risen in many countries, particularly when you look at 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds. You can see we're getting close to universal enrollment in many countries. But when we look at the youngest, the enrollment rates for children under the age of 3, you can see that is still very patchy, very uneven across countries. Even in our host Finland, a country that is very advanced in its school system, some people consider it the gold standard for schooling, but you can see in the early years there's still a lot of work to do to build better access for children. This is one of the perhaps most concerning charts when we actually look at the percentage of 15-year-olds who had attended preschool for 2 years or more, so far as a kind of sustained basis. You can see that children from wealthy background have had a much longer access to preschool than children from poor backgrounds. Think about this for a moment. We often sell early childhood education and care on the premise that it is the great equalizer. It levels the playing field. But you look at this data and you actually see we're seeing the reverse. Those children who need it most get the least out of it, whereas those children from privileged contexts actually had access to more early childhood education and care. So clearly what these data show is that we need to become much better in ensuring that we match resources with needs now. And that's just not just a matter in terms of quantity. I think the same is true for quality. Early childhood education and care is still very fragmented, very localized, very kind of institutional based. We don't have the kind of instruments that we take for granted in schooling, like, for example, universal staff qualifications or, curriculum, shared instructional practice. It's often very localized, very patchy, and what that also leads to often is that children from wealthier backgrounds get access to the more intellectually challenging or social emotionally challenging experience, and therefore get a further advantage, whereas students from disadvantaged backgrounds are left more behind. Look at this chart. You can see basically when you look at the PISA database, you can see that students from privileged backgrounds participated more than those from disadvantaged backgrounds. Students in private school participated more than students in public school, and students in cities participated more than students in rural areas. So again, early childhood education sometimes doing the reverse than it's promised. What can we do about it? Standards, governance, curriculum, pedagogy, workforce development, working conditions, work organization, engagement of families, data and monitoring. Those are instruments that we can actually deploy, and the OECD has done a lot of research and analysis on how to use those kinds of instruments best. I just show you sort of just a few pictures. One of it is that we looked at what kind of aspects of process quality and structural quality were most closely associated with literacy and numeracy skills. When doing meta studies, looking at lots of research studies and trying to see what they had in common, you can see in particularly that the process quality was often more predictive. You see warm and responsive relationships among staff and children were associated in a majority of studies with better literacy and numeracy skills, or developmental and educational activities were associated. Conflict and permissiveness was a bad a very negative predictor for behavioral and social skills. So there's some really interesting research emerging, and we try to summarize it to see what kind of aspects of structural quality and process quality predict learning outcomes. And that brings me sort of to the instrument on curriculum, frameworks and guidance, the learning standards, the specific competencies, dispositions, and then on the pedagogy. There's actually a lot of discussion now. What's the right combination of free and structured play, of teaching and so on? What's the right balance between child and staff-centered pedagogies? And what we actually see is that there are also very different ideas and approaches across countries. And that brings me to the next question, the very kind of very clearly sort of aspect around work conditions. What you can see is that there are a number of countries now where you can talk about parity of salaries between pre-primary and primary school teachers. But there's still a fair number of countries on the left side where you can see clearly that pre-primary teachers are paid a lot less than primary teachers. And you ask yourself why, and probably the only answer you'll find is tradition. That's the way we've always done it. Whereas if we look to the actually requirements, the kind of skills that are required, there's probably not much evidence that suggests that it's easier to teach the very youngest who can articulate themselves least than teaching older children. But you can see that reality has not caught up with this. There is in most countries still a big kind of pay gap. In some countries it goes the other way around, and Portugal, but that's more an artifact of demography. These are tend to be in the early years more older teachers. They get a bit more salary. So I would, we could have marked them in green as well, but basically all I want to say here is that we still have a lot of work to do to close the gap in work organization, curriculum, pedagogy, and pay to ensure that the learning provisions are good. Children's media use, that's something people are often not aware of. If you look, for example, at the age group 5 to 7-year-olds, you can see that 5% of them in the UK have their own smartphone, 42% have their own tablet, 97% watch TV on average for 13.5 hours a week. That's a lot of time actually invested in kind of digital technologies. People have quite different views on whether this is good or bad. Research is often not that quite clear, but one of the things that we see is that this is clearly a trend. Now, you can see again from our PISA surveys between 2012 and 2015, where we surveyed children. We asked 15-year-olds, did they use the internet when they were 6-year-old or younger? And you can see actually in 3 years that share has been risen. And obviously, when we ask children about the age of 6 at age 15, that's a projection in their past. Those numbers are likely to be much higher now when we look at the reality today. Now, again, is it good or bad? One of the things that we know is that digital screen time tends to be negatively related to mental well-being as a tendency. There's a lot of variability. It also depends a lot on the kind of nature of screen time, obviously. But when you look at screen time on computers, you can see that beyond, a minimal level, it goes more in the other direction. I think these things raise very, very big questions for school policy. And of course, what can policy and also union leaders do? It starts with basic things like adopting whole of school approaches to safety issues, also to develop and enact online safety policies and procedures, to deal with issues around cyberbullying. Now, in the past, bullying was physical, it happened in school, but you could escape it, you get home. Now cyberbullying follows you 24 hours. And so this is something that schools need to take on in very different ways. It's about supporting family-school partnerships and also harnessing the power of peers. The last topic of the summit was about what we can do to create more sustainable approaches to schooling. And with sustainability, I don't mean primarily environmental issues, but in a world that is increasingly putting new demands on education, where resources are harder to mobilize, where it's more difficult to attract great people into education, how can we, address those kinds of challenges? And one, test to which you can put education is the question to what extent it delivers consistent quality. Our host Finland shows that you can actually not only make some schools successful, but every school successful. Only about 5% of the performance variation among students lies between schools in the case of Finland. Now, there's still a lot of variability in learning outcomes within schools, which teachers have to deal with, but at least, you don't put difficult questions to parents in choosing their school and so on. Whereas, on the other hand, in the Netherlands, you can see the majority of performance variation lies between schools. Now, the choice of the school is a very strong predictor for the average performance of your children. So that's one of the issues about, sustainability. If we want to get making quality systemic, it's a big challenge for education. Aligning resources with needs. When we looked at the average class size in the 9th grade, you can see in disadvantaged contexts, classes tend to be smaller than in wealthy contexts. You look at this and you say, well, that's great. We're giving disadvantaged children more teachers, so they're going to have, a more intimate environment that's going to be more conducive to learning. That's a very equitable approach to resource allocation. Yeah, but that's just the surface pictures. As soon as you look to, the quality of teaching, it turns the other way around. No? The disadvantaged students had much greater shortage of teachers who are specialized than teachers from privileged contexts. So I think, again, in quantity terms, we may have equitable policies, getting more money to disadvantaged schools. But as soon as you look at the quality of resources, and you find it very similar when you look at the quality of material resources, we find that we're often still regressive. No? The teachers who need the best students are actually getting the ones who are least qualified. Only very few countries have been capable of attracting the most talented teachers to the most challenging classrooms. And again, I repeat this once more, the issue is not just to make teaching financially more attractive, but also intellectually more attractive. And this has to do with public confidence in the profession. It has to do with how we select, how we prepare, how we promote teachers. It's to do with collective ownership of professional practice. This is about professional autonomy, but professional autonomy in a collaborative culture. It's to do with professional responsibility in the name of my profession, and also with accountability, not necessarily towards the hierarchy, but towards the profession. At the OECD, we measure those things through the knowledge that teachers have. Now, what do teachers know about the discipline which they teach? What do they know about the students who they teach? And what do they know about how students learn? We look at the teacher professional autonomy, decision-making power, to what extent are teachers creative designers of the instructional system, and we look at the collaborative culture, participation and induction, mentoring, networks, feedback, and things like this. And when you look at just this last aspect, you can see sort of on the surface, teachers collaborate, they're very social people. But most of that collaboration is on exchange and coordination, discussing individual students, sharing resources, team conferences, whereas the kind of deeper professional collaboration that is so important is actually quite rare. In most countries, you can see it's only a small minority of teachers who regularly observes other teachers' classrooms or engages in joint activities or takes part in collaborative professional development. And we know from our Thales survey that those were the kind of things most predictive of teacher self-efficacy. Whether the more teachers teach jointly as a team, the more they observe other teachers' classes, the more they engage in joint activities or take part in professional learning, you could really see that is a strong predictor of teachers' self-efficacy. And that has to do with work organization. On this chart, I show you on the vertical axis the student-teacher ratio, and on the horizontal axis, the size of the class. And you might think, if I have more teachers, I'll make classes smaller, but that's not the general trend. And you can see, for example, here, you compare the United Kingdom and the 4 regions of China for which we have data in PISA. And you can see on the student-teacher ratio, they are virtually identical. But on the class size, they're hugely different. Now you look at the surface and you might think, well, Britain is much better. You know, they have much smaller classes with the same resources. But actually, there's a price for that. No? Teachers in Britain have very little time for anything else than teaching. They spend most of their time in front of students teaching. If you're a teacher in China, you spend between 11 and 16 hours teaching, and the rest of the time, you know, you work with other teachers to develop better practice. You observe other teachers' classrooms. You work with individual students. You work with parents. You have a much wider range of responsibilities, but often it's those kinds of responsibilities that make the work of teachers rewarding, engaging, and intellectually attractive. So again, you know, similar countries deploying similar resources in very, very different ways, and international comparisons can help us understand those kinds of differences. Some people say, well, you know, class sizes may not lead to more effective learning environments, but they are a big factor for teachers' job satisfaction. Interestingly, we could not find that relationship. Now, there is actually very little change in the teacher's job satisfaction based on the size of their class. The big predictor of teacher job satisfaction has all to do with the degree of professionalization. Now remember, that was about professional knowledge, professional autonomy, and the collaborative culture. Those were the big predictors of teacher job satisfaction, and also teacher self-efficacy, and even the status of the teaching profession. So again, these are quite important insights from international comparisons. And then, of course, the big question, you know, I return to the beginning, you know, how do we make actually change happen? One of the things that we learn, and we discussed it at great lengths, is also that people are much more likely to accept changes if they understand why those changes are happening, if they can actually see the role which they should play within the overall strategy. When you saw, you know, the countries like Singapore, you know, it would never occur to them to a minister to announce a school reform through the media. They always engage the profession. They always bring people along on this trajectory. That brings me to the next step. Now, education leaders are rarely successful with change unless they're capable to build a shared understanding and collective ownership for change. And this is also about building capacity and creating the right policy climate with accountability measures that actually encourage people to think differently, to innovate, rather than just to be, you know, compliant with standards. And that, you know, has huge implications on capacity. Often, you know, when we look at reforms, they have underestimated the resource implication, not just, you know, money. That's perhaps the easier part, but often the human capacity that is needed to manage and implement change. And last but not least, you know, school systems, teachers that are actually looking outwards to the next teacher, the next class, to the next school system tend to be the ones that are open to the world and actually advancing. And that is one other thing that this summit actually revealed to this. That's all I really wanted to share with you, and I look forward to your questions.
It doesn't work in there.
Okay.
So these are the questions.
Okay, I just received the questions here. The first question is the OECD doing research which integrates all of those different knowledge bases, specifically how education will change thanks to digitalization, neuroscience, global science? A very good question. In fact, we just published in January a publication on which is called Trends Shaping Education, where we try to look at how those global trends, mega trends, actually shape the environment in which school systems develop. We also now integrating our TALIS database on teachers more closely with our PISA database on students. We're collecting data from parents, from school principals. And in a way, in education, we now learn a lot through triangulation by bringing different ideas and perspectives together, but it's really hard. And sometimes, you get a picture that is not entirely coherent. When you talk to students about discipline, they may give you a very different picture than when you talk to principals. So this is something that will be with us for a long time, both methodologically, but also in terms of the data sources. Has the OECD looked into the quadruple helix model, integrating business, government, NGOs, universities around shared goals? Absolutely. In fact, that's a very, very important aspect. Education needs to really become everybody's business, and I think the tech sector almost forces us to think more holistically about how we integrate different players on both the demand and supply sides. Some countries are very successful, particularly vocational education has a strong tradition of creating environments with work-based learning, but also in the school sector, some countries actually have quite strong traditions of engaging society in the design of curricula, the development of the instructional model, and so on. Then, slide 25, another question. You comment that we need to invest more in better understanding of learning trajectories. There's very interesting research on plotting the hierarchy of learning trajectories in math and language. I just see now that this was meant to be a copy link to a book on this. The choice of pedagogical instruments depends on the learning objectives, not necessarily the curriculum. Is that right? Well, it's probably both. The learning objectives are always, or should always, I guess, to be part of the instructional system of the curriculum. But countries clearly have quite different traditions here. In some countries, those kinds of curricula are very detailed, very kind of engaged in lesson design, lesson planning, and others, that's a kind of separate activity. So I think that's something that probably traditions differ quite a bit.